So we can just start. Have you recorded?
Absolutely.
You started recording?
Absolutely. Give it a
Okay.
go.
Well, hi everyone. We are back again for another breakdown. We have myself, Samuel, and Felix here with me.
Cheers.
And we're going to be talking about the biggest, most recent events, the Fact in Lyon, and what's the other one's? The Relic Fest, right?
Fest, but I have no idea where it's held, to be honest.
Yeah. And yeah, so just a couple of our thoughts to the meta at those events and it overall. Yeah, so the first thing to talk about in the Fact tournament is that old Rutstein made it into the top 8, which is a pretty big achievement for being kind of the first to bring a commander like that, which is already a couple of sets old, into a top 8 when on the face of it, at least from what I could tell, it doesn't seem like the most powerful commander. So it's a pretty versatile commander in the sense where it's kind of random what he hits in the first 1 or 2 mills, but what you do have when you hit a non-land, non-creature card is a blood token, which allows you to pitch your threats and reanimate them, which is a pretty strong synergy. So the deck is basically playing all the dorks it can in order to resolve Rutstein on 2 and then start reanimating on 3. Being a 1/4, it's pretty hard to kill. So yeah, it's one of those utility commanders that seems to work pretty well with everything else that's in the deck. And yeah, definitely an interesting card.
It's super interesting. Like, just thinking about it, I think we had it on cam once, but I played it in a completely different direction, like more like a Golgari rock, if you so will, with the best density of interaction, and I was more going for synergies with Bloodghast and Vengevines and Hogak and whatsoever. More like a mid-range approach. But yeah, the blood token, as you mentioned, is definitely worth to use some big boys and discard them and reanimate them later on.
Yeah.
And if we look at the list, he has a couple of choices for that. There's Grave Titan, Primeval Titan, the usual suspects, but also bigger ones, Titan of Industry, Archon of Cruelty, and whatsoever. So that's definitely an interesting take on the deck. And yeah, I was quite surprised to see it in top 8, to be honest. But why not? The player was curious enough or courageous enough to innovate here with this commander. And that's always an advantage if you enter an unknown territory, or your opponent has to enter an unknown territory. If you face this commander, it could be anything, or maybe based on your experience, what your thoughts were when maybe you've tried to build old Rutstein at some point, and then you have in mind what you came up with, but you have no idea what your opponent comes up with. And I'm pretty sure he managed to surprise one or another at some point by reanimating
Definitely.
an Apex Altisaur or stuff like that. So that's quite cool.
Yeah, and one thing that's quite strong about that is that the blood token allows you to have this onboard discard that you don't have to use right away. So you can wait till you find more threats. It doesn't do much digging for you, and you can be very flexible when you want to reanimate, which is good based on the amount of incidental graveyard hate that we have in the format, where you can just basically make the opponents trigger their graveyard hate, whether it be it Kaya's Guile or Lantern of Insight, or not Lantern of... What's the Soul Guide Lantern, I mean?
Soul Guide Lantern, yes.
And once they've used it, you can still have a blood token on board in order to try again and reanimate.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also like the synergies around the insects it produces are also great. Unfortunately, compared to Grist, it's not like a reliable effect, but still you can use cards like Recurring Nightmare, which you usually don't see in Reanimator shells, as they are these days run by Aminatou. We will get back to that later, but the point is that you don't have any creature to sacrifice into the Nightmare in order to play it as the 6th, 7th, 8th reanimation spell in your 99. Good. What else do we have in this top 8? There is Balmor, 2 times Balmor, 2 times Aminatou. That's quite interesting. If we look at the Balmor list, so I think since this card was printed in Dominaria United, people realized it's a much better Adeliz, and you see versions with and without counter magic, and we have both of these, or both approaches here in the top 8. So the upper one is featuring, I would say, the most efficient counter spells, while the latter does not, and both seems to be successful. Probably comes down to your personal taste. I mean, I always like to have some amount of counter magic because it helps you controlling shenanigans your opponent might be up to, because especially for Izzet, some things you can't really control, like if we're talking about synergistic decks, affinity, enchantress, whatsoever, but also denying some combos is not too bad. If
graveyard strategies,
yes, exactly,
usually
stuff like that.
Counter spells are the best place to interact with reanimation.
Yeah, right. So that's why I personally like to have a few outs against something like that. But maybe on the other hand, maybe this deck is that fast if your opponent does not manage to handle Balmor in time that you don't need it. I don't know. I haven't played against a counter magic-less version so far. Everything I've seen or I've faced was playing a few counter spells at least. But why not? We've also seen some takes on very RDV-ish versions, if you so will, featuring a minimum amount of blue cards overall, and playing a very creature-based version with a lot of burn spells and stuff, which might work too. I'm happy to see this card. It kind of, how to say, it represents Izzet in a nice fashion. I think it's not like the tempo-ish style that I prefer, that was played back in the days with Ludovic and Crown, but still, I think it's good to have something like that around in the metagame.
And it's also the, what's it called? It's also, Ludovic allows for that kind of playstyle.
Absolutely, yes.
Where you keep drawing those cards, and you can make it out in the long run. And the Izzet commanders that we've had since then, kind of like the Adeliz and other kind of fast prowess damage type decks, they have to try and win the game with the 10 to 15 cards that they see in it. And those are the cards that are going to have to win them the game, as opposed to Ludovic being able to rely on what comes afterwards. So, I think you see a shift in aggressiveness between those styles, simply because
I think
counterspells are a bit less viable.
Exactly. I mean, it's also like, since, the partner change, we've talked about it a couple of times, the partner change really affected the Ludovic strategy, or the Ludovic decks, since there is still this list floating around with Jeska, and that's a fine deck, I think. But the fact that you just have to play either of them makes it way worse. And if you look at the power today's command zones put to the table, Chrome kind of compensated that, and nowadays you have to pick either or, which makes it quite hard. Since like the other decks can do similar things or can come up with similar magic, just with a better command zone, as we see here with Balmor, for example.
Yep, definitely.
So if we take another look at the top 8, there is also, I've said we will come back to Aminatou, and we've talked about it prior to starting the podcast, that it seems while Aminatou was for quite some time a very popular Esper control deck, it seems that Tivit took that position, and Aminatou is now more of a reanimator shell. And while we've seen other versions, and we've also experimented with that on a channel, we had there was Golos reanimation, it was Kenrith reanimation. I think we played Yoda. We had Rafine.
Played Yoda. I also have in the past played Aminatou Reanimator while the control variant was still popular. However, a recent set of prints has made the deck a lot more viable. If you look at, so maybe this was like 1.5, 2 years ago, maybe a bit more recent, but there are a couple of cards that have kind of changed how the deck functions, where you have like a Priest of Fell Rites, which gives you the option to have the ability to reanimate built into your Buried Alive, which makes Buried Alive a lot better. You have Faithful Mending being printed, and Tainted Indulgence, and Occult Epiphany, which are 3 premium discard spells that you previously didn't have access to. Correct. Bone Shards has been printed in Modern Horizons 2. You've got another tutor in Profane Tutor. Persist, Unmarked Grave, Archon of Cruelty has come along. So the deck has gained a lot of very good cards that you were missing in previous versions of the builds.
And we also, like, the quality of the threats also increased a lot, right? These days, yes. we even have, especially talking about the Flicker synergy with Aminatou's minus ability.
Cards like Lord of Change, drawing your 3 cards, being able to flicker it to draw another 3 cards.
Or Tivit, for example.
That as well, yeah. So like, where we used to have a few targets that were a bit worse, that you were playing kind of as filler, these versions of the builds have the ability to reanimate once, and if that doesn't win the game, they have the ability to reanimate again and again and again, simply because of all the value that the reanimation targets bring and all the good cards that you have in your deck, where you used to spend a lot of time trying to get your threat into the graveyard and then reanimate it and then hope it's stuck, but that isn't the case anymore, where you can just keep reanimating and win the game with a lot of value and on the long term.
Right, and even if not, you can, like, sometimes you can progress the game in a way that you just get to a point at which you can hardcast your targets, because while they're getting more powerful, like Tivit, for example, or Lord of Change, they come with Ward 3, which is a disgusting ability. We all know that. We've experienced it again, or Ward in general, we've experiencing it against Rafine, against Tivit, against Gerson, and whatsoever. You get in range of casting these spells quite quickly these days, because the mana cost is reduced. We have like MV6, MV7 back in the days. I remember when we played reanimation targets, they used to cost like 8 or 9, like Iona and Grizzlebrand, for example. So that's quite an upside too.
Yep. And in the past, those 5-color variants, they were relying a lot on Bazaar of Baghdad, and that kind of strategy obviously has 1 less mana in play. So you're even another turn, even if you manage to hit your land drops, if you don't have a lot of card disadvantage, you're still behind on casting your threats. So yeah, so we've had this very interesting shift, which is across everything in the present Relic Fest as well, where we have 3 dominant Esper decks, where you have Aminatou in the reanimation slot, Tivit in the control slot, and then Rafine in the tempo slot.
That's true. By the time we're recording this, the Relic Fest is not yet finished. They're currently playing the top 8, I guess, which is quite interesting, but apart from 2 decks, I would say it's nothing too special if you look at the previous top 8s of bigger events. And now that we've looked at the fact top 8, there was Aminatou, there was Rafine, there was Tivit. These are the 3 decks Samuel just mentioned. And we have a similar top 8 here at the Relic Fest. As far as I know, there are 2 Rafines, 2 Grists, Leovold, Tivit, Sithis, and the last match isn't yet decided, either a 3rd Rafine or a Jeska deck. So I have no idea about that, but in general, we don't see any Aminatou, but Rafine and Tivit is represented, and Grist is being at the top of tournaments for quite some time now. What I personally find interesting is, and that's a game that I've watched yesterday on day 1, that Leovold made it to the top 8. What's important to mention here might be that it's piloted by a professional French player. Nevertheless, it was a very interesting game against Nif Mizzet, and from the cards I've seen, the player made some interesting decisions. For example, help me out, how's the spell called again? Diminishing Returns, I think. Yeah, I think it was Diminishing Returns, right? It's a yeah, we will show the card here. It's a 4-mana wheel. And I've also seen Stifle and Misdirection and a couple of cards that you see every now and then in Leovold lists. And with Rafine and Aminatou and other cards being present in a command zone, you've seen a rise in popularity regarding Leovold in the chess metagame, for example, too. So the last time we went there were like 6 or 7 Leovolds, and 2 of them made them in into the top 8, I think.
Yeah, I mean, there is a big love of Leovold in the format. I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is because Sultai Magic doesn't seem to have much representation, and it's a very popular color combination. One thing that I enjoy, and I think that everyone who likes playing control decks or something around that area likes to have is a deck that can basically win anything. And Leovold is definitely one of those decks where it has the ability, if it draws the right combination of cards, to basically win any matchup.
True.
How that zeroes out over, or how that averages out is, I think, a lot of matchups are kind of like 45-55 out of favor of Leovold, of the kind of top matchups. But when piloted well, when you have a good player who is very familiar with the Leovold deck, you kind of can change those odds.
True.
And I think there's a lot of appeal in that for many players.
Yeah, like it's funny because whenever new players in Darmstadt, for example, that have been in contact with Legacy at some point, for example, when those players join Duel Commander, they're like, what, you can play Leovold? Or maybe they're like even framed for multiplayer Commander where Leovold is banned for obvious reasons. They're like, wow, you can play this card, it must be insanely busted. And at first it might look like, but that's actually not the case. Yes, it has some strong synergies, that's for sure. But on the other hand, it has also it brings some weaknesses. For example, being a boltable buddy for MV3 is something you most often say, usually I want my commander to be bolt proof, but okay, at least it brings a card. The Sultai card pool is certainly strong, but if we look at how many upgrades and improvements the Esper pool got recently, or over the couple of last month, even years, you might question if you should really play Sultai over Esper these days. Maybe that changes in the future. I wish it would, because I really enjoy to play Sultai over Esper personally. But if we look at the most recent set, or Brothers War, which is not yet released, but soon will, I think there is something like for our format, an upgraded Maelstrom pools in Orzhov colors, and there's also a new white 1-mana removal spell that might substitute Oust, for example. So currently it does not look like. Oh well, maybe I'm wrong. There was Tear Asunder, I think it's called. That was 2-mana instant speed spell with a black kicker. It's a green one. It exiles an artifact or an enchantment, and if you pay the kicker cost, you can exile a normal permanent instead, I think.
Yep, that was 4 mana when kicked, so that was pretty expensive.
Yeah, that's true, but probably still an interesting card to play. In terms of cost efficiency ratio, not yet arrived at what Esper spells do in return, or in comparison, I mean. But maybe we'll get there at some point. Some players have argued in the past that in order to play Sultai control, this format would need back Tazigur, which I think is an interesting idea. We've also talked about that with Florian Trott when we had our first podcast with the Duel Commander Rules Committee, or 2 members of the Rules Committee. But yeah, now we're here and we have Leovold in the top 8, and I think that's very cool. I personally love to play the deck, and I think it never gets boring. But apart from that, Samuel, we also have the usual suspects, Rafine and Grist. I don't know, like there's not even much to say about that. Just two very powerful decks. And as I said earlier, we see them every now and then. If you want to play tempo these days, you have to have a very good reason not to play Rafine.
Yep, definitely. You have answers to everything. You have a pretty confident, not confident, pretty big set of creatures that can be good. The lack of bolts sometimes hurts, where you'd like to be able to play a lightning bolt and chain lightning and finish the opponent off with damage sometimes. But the card pool is very strong, and there's no denying that.
Yeah, definitely. Tivit is a deck we could discuss with Martin. I think he's not bored discussing Tivit. Also, classic control, as I just said. Esper card pool is very powerful, and Grist offers a toolbox mid-rangey game plan that has some power plays or enables some power plays around certain cards. It's actually quite hard for a lot of decks to deal with a turn 2 Planeswalker that's elsewhere a creature, so you can, for control matchups, you can't spell pierce it, you can't play Force of Negation, Dovin's Veto, and whatsoever.
Yep.
Which makes it even harder every now and then to handle it on stack.
And when you don't have a removal for it as explicitly as a Planeswalker, it comes in with 4 loyalty, so bolting it is bad, and you have to put several big creatures up against it in order to kill it in combat, because the first 1 or even 2 it can just simply kill with its minus ability for very little cost. So you have to be kind of careful how you navigate around that.
Yeah, that's true. And then there's Sithis, which is a deck that pops up every now and then, even without Serra Sanctum, which I think is totally fine. Just shows that the deck is still good enough to make it into the top 8.
Yeah, meaning it's pretty unnecessary that
we
Sanctum got banned. I think we've talked about that.
I know we can delay that to to another day, or we can like talk about it somewhere else. But yeah, it's pretty much apart from Leobold, these two are kind of unique. I would be curious if it's the Jeska deck or the third Rafine. Would be cool to see the Jeska deck. I assume it's Ludovic Jeska, but I think might also be something else. Maybe Boros Jeska. I have no idea. I've seen a lot of different decks on cam yesterday and today. There was Boros Yoshi in the top tables. There was Florian Trott played an interesting Golos variant with basically a 5-color creature toolbox with a few initiative enablers and lots of diversity. Some wind graces and what else? Niv-Mizzet Reborn, by the way. There were a lot of Niv-Mizzet Reborns, so that's a very popular deck. I think it always has been, and the maybe Tivit and Rafine and other decks and Gris and stuff that's more played lately kind of took the spotlight off of Niv-Mizzet, but it remained a good deck, and we see Wizards continuing to print powerful 2-color cards, and the recent addition of the remaining 5 Triomes also gave another boost to the deck in terms of consistency, so it's definitely a very powerful deck.
Yeah, definitely. When you look at the top 8, though, I think we've got a very strong presence of Esper, and if you have a deck that can compete with that level, which isn't too difficult, I think there's a lot of decks that kind of can compete with the Rafines and the Tivits and the Aminatous when you play a couple of sideboard cards to handle the reanimative variants, and yeah, you have some good draws against the tempo decks. I think the meta is still very open at the moment. I think there's no this is the most powerful deck or these are the few most powerful decks. Still pretty wide, which I like.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm totally with you. Every now and then I still feel like players should board a bit more graveyard hate, because I mean this was a 308 players event, which is by the way the biggest Duel Commander tournament that was ever held, and they broke the record twice. The last one was like 256 players, I think, or 254. which was already the biggest one, and now they have set up an even bigger event, which is great. It's amazing. So I'm very curious to see the metagame breakdown. I think there were all kinds of decks represented, but when I look back at our event in October in Darmstadt, we had lots of combo decks actually being present. Like there was the Beamtown combo deck, there was Keenan, there were some Reanimator strategies and stuff like this. And apart from Keenan, most of these, and also Grist and partially Rafine, most decks have some stuff to do with the graveyard. If it's removing, like, or when we look at the Cheshmater, for example, there were a couple of Hogaaks available that you had to face and stuff like this. So it still feels like some people underestimate the necessity of boarding Graveyard Hate. But apart from that, I'm completely with you. So there's you can definitely play anything. And I think Azizorek player at our event showed that even the rogue decks are capable of going for a debate.
Yep, and something like the old Rutstein at the Fact event. Yeah.
Good. So I'm curious how the top 8 of the Relic Fest turns out today. Yeah, I'm just thinking about, are there any more events this year? I think this is pretty much the last one, right? So we can look forward to pimp our pools with Brothers War editions again and play a couple of new cool cards. Fortunately, there is no command zone. To me, that's too much of a...
Yeah, we've done some testing with the Urza, with the
Azorius
Urza, and haven't been too impressed. Yeah, I think we're just going to have to see how that plays out, since one thing that keeps surprising me when you look at the biggest additions to Eternal formats from recent sets, where you have cards like Fable of the Mirror Breaker and Ledger Shredder. Can't think of anything else right now, but those are cards that have been very slow they were printed, and I think Fable was at €1 for like an entire set until people started playing it, and now it's a €30 card.
Yeah.
There are a lot of cards being released, and every now and then you'll see a card that's like 2 sets old that you've never seen before that's actually pretty good. And I think that's an exciting future for Duel Commander, where we have an even larger breadth of cards that can be played in our format, as opposed to like Modern or Pioneer. And you can kind of explore those cards and maybe even find something that no one's seen before, no one's played before in that way, and be one of the first people to do that, or even the first person to do that, and actually make other people build the deck or put up a good result at a tournament with it, and do cool stuff and be kind of a pioneer in that space. Which I think is very attractive. Very cool thing to be able to do in a format. And we see it happening with the density of cards being released, even in formats that seem to have these very rigorous metas, and lots of people play them, and lots of people test in them, and lots of brains try to find good decks in those formats, and you still find these decks pop up that no one's thought of before. So I think there's still quite a bit of room to innovate, and when you have a format that's as open as the one we're playing now, where you have Rafine and Tivit and Aminatou and Grist being these kind of very dominant decks, or not very dominant, but like being these decks that are present in the top 8s, but are all quite beatable. Most decks have a path to defeat them. Most of the games are tight, even with decks that might not be considered as high up in the meta as others. So yeah, I think this is it's a good time to innovate.
It always is, and I think the chances of finding something to innovate with are increasing with every set, because Wizards is just offering us so many cards, especially for the command zone and also for the 99. And we know sometimes there are piles that are not yet good enough, but they're waiting for like an addition of 4 or 5 slots that make it playable. You see that every now and then. So it was a very nice closing word, but I just want to mention, because we talked a lot about Esper and you mentioned Urza, and we're talking about new sets, and there is this Esper Urza, and people are hyped about it, and I think it's an interesting commander. It's a powerful ability. Affinity for artifact creatures was not yet printed on a card. But if I look at the current artifact creatures, I think this deck is exactly of this kind that it just needs a couple of more good artifact creatures to be printed in order to be as consistent as we want it to be. Maybe that's something we will show on the channel too. I personally like the card a lot. At some point it might become the 4th Esper commander that joins the party. We don't know, but
in a completely different avenue than the 3 that are
absolutely,
present at the moment, which is very cool.
Which also challenges players again from a different aspect in terms of now you have to take care of dealing with artifacts again. So it's not like, okay, we can push our usual game plan, and then we have in mind to board a couple of graveyard hate cards, but now you have to take care, like, it's not only Reality Chip or Zai you can face, it's also this Urza that brings up relevant artifact creatures, and that's another angle to take care of. But we will see. I'm always curious to see what players are up against or what they bring to the table. Good. So with that being said,
thanks for watching.
Thanks for
listening,
tuning in, and see you next time.
Yeah.
Bye bye.
See you next time.